I'm Philip, this is Andrada, and you are one of the best authors of our time, I think, and Christopher Paolini. Great to have you in Leipzig in Germany.
It's a pleasure to be here. This is my first time in the city. Not my first time in Germany, but I've only been to a couple of other cities, so, and never to this book festival.
Where have you been in Germany, actually?
I'm going to butcher the names. So I have been to Berlin, I've been to Frankfurt, I have been to München, and the one I cannot say properly, which is Cologne.
Ah, okay,
Köln.
it's Köln.
Köln.
Yes.
Yeah.
So what do you like most in Germany? Is the food, driving cars very fast, or the medieval castles, for example?
The castles are beautiful, the cathedrals are gorgeous. Probably I think what I like the most here is the enormous number of readers. This is one of the largest reading populations in the world. So I have a huge fan base here, and I always enjoy visiting and getting to talk with them. And there's also a large number of people here who are familiar with the old myths and legends, you know, Nordic legends, Scandinavian, Germanic, and that's not something, despite the popularity of fantasy in general, that's not something that's as common in the United States, which is surprising given that that's where the roots of a lot of modern fantasy come from.
Okay, well, coming to your tour, you are at the moment at the Europe tour. Do you enjoy it being in Europe again?
I do. I'm actually a dual US-Italian citizen, so I can live and work in the EU, at least as long as the EU is still together. No, I enjoy Europe, and this is a long tour. I did 2 weeks of touring in the United States, and then I'm doing most of March in the UK and Europe, so it's 5 weeks of touring overall.
Do you still have family in Italy?
Excuse me?
Do you still have family in Italy, or
I do, in Rome and Florence. Originally the family was from Bologna.
Ah, okay, but it's spread.
It spread as a result of World War II.
Okay.
Okay, coming to you as an author, and of course to your books, they are very popular in Germany and I think all over the world, thanks to you, of course. But your first try to bring the book to the market was publishing it in a very small, independent, it's a publisher.
Actually, we self-published it. So it wasn't even a publisher, it was just my family and I trying to get the word out about Eragon.
Because it's very awesome how the evolution of the book was during or on the way from self-publishing to worldwide success. Do you expect this this way?
Absolutely not. When I was working on Eragon, I thought that maybe my parents would read the book. I certainly didn't expect my sister to read it. I never expected people all around the world to be reading it. I mean, I wrote Eragon living in an 80-year-old farmhouse, which you have to understand, an 80-year-old farmhouse in Montana means that it was one of the first structures ever built in the state. And it was this old place that we heated with a wood stove, and we had asbestos shingles on the siding of the house, and there were rats and mice in the walls. And you know, I wrote by the Yellowstone River, and I wrote this story there, and now because of it I've had this amazing experience. So it's something I'm very, very grateful for.
Did it somehow also influence your idea? I mean, you talked about woods, and it reminded me a bit of Eragon's childhood. And,
definitely. I mean, I might have written fantasy if I'd grown up in New York City, but I think it would have been a different kind of fantasy, and having the physical experience of being in the woods, of climbing trees and running into bears in the forest and that sort of thing, definitely it gave me details I could use in the writing, and it's one of the reasons I loved fantasy, because of all the books I read growing up, fantasy was one of the few genres that actually felt familiar to me, because so much of fantasy is set outdoors. You know, you're on horses, you're in battles, you're outdoors, and so much of modern fiction is not outdoors because most people live in cities, most people live indoors, and that's unfortunate.
And do you have special authors you like to read in their childhood?
Of course. I was a fan of Tolkien, of course, C.S. Lewis, David Eddings, Tad Williams, Raymond Feist, Ursula K. Le Guin, the Wizard of Earthsea trilogy, Dune by Frank Herbert, the Mabinogion Tetralogy by Evangeline Walton, the Worm Ouroboros by E.R. Edison, the Gormenghast Trilogy by Mervyn Peake, and I can keep going and
So
going.
many books.
Yes.
What was it like for you to be such a huge author? And you were very young when your first book
Yeah.
came out.
You're still
when
very
you,
young.
When you published
Of
it,
course.
yes, you're still very young. I mean, you wrote 4 books, now 5. And I think you were 15 when you wrote it, as far as I remember.
Yeah.
What was it like? I mean, it's a phenomenon and you were so young.
It's hard for me to answer that because I don't have any other life to compare it to.
Yeah.
This has been my life.
Yeah, sure.
As I've gotten older, I have gotten more perspective, and so I look back on the experience and I go, wow, that was a really weird experience, you know? And I understand better now why, you know, authors who were older than me, who are my age now or even older, were looking at me and kind of shaking their heads and going, you know, you don't understand what's happening. And it's true, I didn't understand what was happening. The difficult part with that sort of attention is learning how to deal with the attention, because I'm not saying this to sound self-serving, it's just, this is the truth when you're on book tour, which is pretty much every room I was in, everyone wanted to talk to me. Everyone wanted to hear what I had to say. Even right now, what we're doing right now with this interview, you know, the point is to hear what I have to say. And that's a strange thing. And it's not a normal thing, and it's not how your life is normally. I actually have great sympathy for young people who become musicians and get a lot of attention, or actors, and I think that one of the reasons they so often go off the rails, especially when they get into their mid-20s, is, you know, in your late teens, early 20s, you have a lot of energy. You know, it's your adolescent energy, you're burning it off, and you can push really, really hard. But if you don't form healthy habits, if you don't learn how to deal with this, by your mid-20s, you hit the wall.
Yeah.
I was lucky that I had a really good family around me, and they helped give me a normal life when I was home, helped support me through all the crazy attention, and that made it possible to... I won't say I'm normal, but I'm functional, and that's important.
Well, now you're adult, of course, obviously, but looking back to your childhood and your first writing process, would you do anything else from now on?
I mean, I could certainly, if I were to go back, I could write Eragon at a higher technical level, so as you would expect. I wouldn't change the story. The only thing I would change in Eragon is I would add one more scene when Saphira is a baby dragon. One more thing, little, you know, anecdote where Eragon and Saphira, Eragon's raising Saphira. I think that was a special time in the story, and I would have liked a little bit more there. In Eldest, I would have added one more chapter with Nasuwada's point of view when the Varden travel from Trondheim to Surda, because it's a big journey and we don't see anything of that. But other than that, I did the work I needed to do in order to produce that book, and there's not a whole lot I could have done to make it better at that time.
But it's so lovely because we grew up with your books, and you grew up
I
with
grew
your
up with the books,
as well. That's a special situation, and nobody could expect, because most authors are old.
Yeah.
Much older than you are, or in the situation you wrote your first book. And is it hard for you to be in competition with all these successful authors like George R. R. Martin or Patrick Rothfuss, for example, because they are on a huge pressure because based on the fans, because they always want a new book, and did you face the same situation?
Funnily enough, the last time I published a book prior to The Fork, The Witch and the Worm was 2011, and that is the same year that George R. R. Martin released his last book and Patrick Rothfuss released his last book, so it's the curse of 2011. I felt a lot of pressure when I was working on the Inheritance Cycle, and of course there was the film, and then there was talk of making a sequel, and so I knew if I didn't finish the books that the movies would pass me by. But at a certain point you have to write the story for yourself and not worry about what other people would think. In some ways it was unfair that you publish a book as a teenager and get compared with Tolkien or Martin or something, because it's not fair. You don't have the skills to compete necessarily. But that's also the wonderful thing about writing, is that you can be in the middle of nowhere and write a story, and if you do your job properly, you can compete with Tolkien or whomever. So, you know, I just wrote the best version of the story that I could, and I'm fortunate that enough people enjoyed reading it that I've been able to do this as a profession since, I mean, 2002 at this point.
I think it was a bit supportive that everyone was thinking that book 4 was the last one, so the pressure was a bit gone away after 2011, I think.
Yes.
But still many fans are asking for book 5.
Yeah.
Do you have ideas for a 5th book, or do you want to explore a new world, for example?
Well, a couple of things. So first of all, I refuse to write under contract anymore because I was under deadlines for over a decade, and that just was not fun for me. After I finished the book, I was touring for it all the way into 2012, and then I needed a break because I worked on the Inheritance cycle from 1998 until 2011, 2012, and that took me from 15 to 27, 28. And that's a huge chunk of anyone's life. So I needed a break. I worked on a couple other projects. I worked on a screenplay that didn't work. I wrote some other short stories and a short novel that may see the light of day someday. And then I have been working on a massive science fiction novel full of spaceships, lasers, aliens, explosions, and tentacles. And the cool thing is when I get home from this tour, I am literally only a week and a half from finishing the current version. So once I finish it, I will sit down and read it through, and if I like what I read, I will give it to my agent, and if he likes what he reads, there's a good chance that this book will be published either this year or early next year.
Wow.
So you're going to get another book soon.
Great news.
And it's a big one. It's
wow.
a big one.
Okay.
As for Allegasia, I have more collections of short stories planned in the future, and more full-sized novels. I always planned on coming back to this world with a full-size novel, and I have one all plotted out and ready to go.
Oh, great.
I've been calling it Book 5, but it's just a question of time and getting to write it and all of that.
Oh, great. Looking
I think
forward.
it's good that you took the time, actually. I mean, the readers always say, we want a new book, but it's better to think about the world you created and to take the time and to give us a good story than to just put something in, let him
also,
do that and that.
I spent so long working on the series that I actually needed time off to basically live a normal life for a few years and learn some things that I hadn't had a chance to learn when I was just so focused on writing, touring. So I think my writing has, as a result, my writing has improved dramatically, and also my understanding of people and myself, and that's just something that comes with experience. You can't force that.
You just mentioned your world, Allegasia. It's huge, it's massive, there are so many details. How was it to create such a world, and how many influences do you have for this world, like outdoor places or other worlds?
More influences that I can tell you. In the real world, of course, the mountains where I live are a huge influence, but also the entire American West and Southwest. The Dark Tower of Stone Hellgrind, where the Razak are, it was inspired by a formation called Shiprock in New Mexico. This is a spoiler, but the sandstone hills where Braun dies are based on Arches National Park in Utah. So lots of things like that. Fictionally, of course, lots of influences from the fantasy authors I read, but developing the world was actually easier than you might think because I didn't start with the world. And if I had, it would have been harder, because if you start with the world, then you just think about the world and you create it, and that's fun, but none of it matters if there isn't a story.
Yeah.
So for me, it started with one idea, and that idea was a young man finds a dragon egg out in the forest, which I loved that concept. But that's not a story, that's an event.
Yeah.
So I asked myself questions. I said, what sort of a world would a dragon come from? How did the dragon egg end up there? How does the young man end up there? Who else would be looking for a dragon egg? What sort of a family does the young man have? How do they support themselves? And so forth and so on. And by asking those questions and then attempting to answer them as honestly as possible, I was able to create the world and the story and the characters for the series. So the world evolved as I wrote the story, but I did do a lot of world building prior to starting the series, and you know, I had all the races in place, I had all the cities in place and all that. So.
Well, is Eragon some part of yourself? Do you always wanted to be a dragon rider?
Oh yeah.
Definitely.
Who doesn't? No, Eragon very much started as me.
Yeah.
I mean, the easiest thing for a 15-year-old boy to write about is a 15-year-old boy. But over the course of the first book, and then the later ones, he does a lot of stuff I've never done. I mean, he rides dragons, he fights monsters, he rescues beautiful elven princesses, which there is a shortage of those in the world these days. All of those things. So he becomes his own person, and then, you know, I became my own person by writing the series. The biggest similarity between the two of us these days is his unending sense of curiosity. You know, he's always asking questions about the world, and then also his sense of optimism, his hope for the future. That said, the older I get, the more I feel I empathize more and more with Brahm versus Eragon. Which is partly because of the beard, I think.
Yeah.
Okay. I have a theory, which is that if you write fantasy long enough, you spontaneously grow a beard. And I go to all these fantasy conventions, and I have presented this theory to other authors, and they have all agreed with me, including the women. So, if you're a woman who writes fantasy, watch out. That beard is coming.
Okay. I think your world has everything a good fantasy world needs. A great map, great characters, dragons. But I have to say that I've got many problems with your book series in the beginning, because I first watched the movie and
there was a movie?
No.
No, it didn't exist.
But I was very disappointed after it, so I didn't read your books for a long time, and now I just say why you waited so long, because it's awesome.
No, thank you.
Well, do you want to change the film, or do you like anything of it?
Well,
would you like to see a TV series, for example?
All right, let me put it this way. I'm very happy that a movie was made, because so few books are ever adapted into film, and the movie, in all honesty, introduced the series to millions of new readers, and as the author, I have to think that's a good thing.
Yeah.
Of course.
I gave as much input as I could into the making of the film, but ultimately it reflected the vision of the story that the director and the studio had. So everyone's free to enjoy the books and the movie on their own rights. I very much would like to see a remake or a new version, and in fact we were just talking about this. Disney just bought 20th Century Fox, which is the studio that made Eragon, which means that as of right now, Arya is technically a Disney princess.
So they still have the rights to Eragon.
Well, because
options.
they made the first book into a film, so they own those film rights. They don't own the film rights to the other books.
Okay.
But the problem is they own the character rights, which means I can't do anything with the characters. And that's because when Eragon was made, Hollywood was not used to adapting these big franchises yet, and the contracts have changed. Nowadays, when you make a film out of a franchise property, you don't get the rights to the characters in all the rest of the books, you don't get the world rights, and that's a bit unfortunate, but it is what it is. So, yeah, I've been getting angry texts from a friend of mine who collects Disney memorabilia and is a huge Disney fan, and she's aggravated that I now have claim to a Disney princess, and she's just like, you know, you're going to be insufferable over this.
Another question regarding your figures and creatures. Why dragons, and do you have another creature you always want to write about?
Why dragons? Because
They're awesome, of course.
They're awesome. I mean, I love dinosaurs growing up, like so many kids, and when you're a kid, a dragon is like a dinosaur plus. You know, they can fly, they can breathe fire, they're usually smart enough to talk, and if you're friends with one, they can eat anyone you don't like. I mean, that's like the perfect friend right there. Also, from a mythological standpoint, dragons are in both Western and Eastern legends are usually linked to the creation of the world and also the destruction of the world. And that lends dragons a mythological weight that you don't get with other creatures. I mean, think of it this way. If you're watching a movie, and it doesn't matter what genre it is, it's science fiction. There's spaceships fighting around Saturn, and there's spaceships exploding out there, and lasers, and all of a sudden, a dragon shows up. You know, you immediately know things just got serious. You know, it's a romantic comedy in New York City, and a dragon shows up. Any movie, any story is immediately improved by adding a dragon. And there aren't really many mythological creatures aside from dragons that you can say that about. So, as for other creatures I'd like to write about, I mean, I kind of did that in the new book with the Urgles, with the character of Ilgra.
I really liked that we had an insight to them more in the new book. And a story from their folk and, just typically how they live and how they act, and that they have families, that they also have this sense of a family, and that they also can suffer, that they can laugh. It's just, we have more in the original series. We have more of an insight to the warriors, and they are strong and they fight, and I really like that. It was a great part of the new book.
That was my favorite section of the book also, so I'm glad you enjoyed it.
And it's a great story as well.
Thank you, and it was a real challenge for me, personal challenge, to attempt to tell a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end, all of which was satisfying in under 1,000 pages, or 5,000 pages.
But as you said before, you plan to write more novels or more little stories that we would get. Did you have in mind from the beginning? We get to see characters we loved from the first series.
Yes.
And did you have in mind? Okay, I want to do that with Elva. I want to do that with Angela. And
no, the Elva-Angela story was completely unplanned by me. That was my sister's idea.
That's what I wanted to say next.
She came to me and she said that she had an idea for her character, the one I based off of her, and I didn't ask what the idea was. I just said, if you have an idea, go write it, because she's very familiar with my world, and I know she would work well within it. And that's what she did, and she brought me back the story. I provided some suggestions based off my knowledge of my world, but most, 90% of that's all her. And what she did is very difficult, which is to, come into someone else's world and write with someone else's character and make it work.
Yeah, but it fitted very well, because when I read it, it was, we see what Angela wrote, and you can see a twist of writing, and that's really great.
Yes, her voice is different.
Her voice is completely different. And what did she say when you came to her when you were younger and said, "Hey, there's a character in my book"? And
I didn't tell her. I just put her in the book in the second draft of Eragon, and then I think she just kind of rolled her eyes. I mean, fortunately, she has a good sense of humor, and she put up with it. Yeah.
That's great.
I'll tell you, Elva is actually the female form of a male name that you may be more familiar with, which is Elvis.
Ah, okay.
Oh.
And in the real world, they both mean the same thing, which is elf friend.
Oh, great.
So.
Oh, the more you know. Yeah.
But you're always creating so many different names. What's happening in your head?
Madness. Names are hard. I mean, names are really hard. I do kind of cheat because, as in the first story in the new book, I'll use Scandinavian or Germanic names on occasion because that fits the feel of some of those northern environments. And that means I don't have to create something from scratch, which is nice. But no, I'm always thinking of names and languages, and that's hard, but it's very, very important. And for example, the science fiction book I'm finishing up, I've been tormenting myself for probably 2 years now because I need a name for this whole science fiction universe I've created, which includes the real world. I need a term for it. I can't call it Alagasia. I need something that encompasses it, and simply calling it the Paolini verse is a bit much. So.
No, it's great.
It is good, but is that a branding thing? No, no. It needs to fit within the story itself. So, yeah.
Okay, coming back to all the different names you created, because I really like the idea that names and languages are so important in your world. But if I'm not wrong, you didn't learn a different language. So how was it like to create a different language without knowing another language?
Well, I definitely did not do as good of a job if I would have done a better job if I knew another language. It's not actually very common in the United States to learn a second language because, I mean, the population of the United States is what, 380 million some people, and I mean the state of Montana, just the state of Montana, is the size of Germany. And we only have slightly under 1 million people in the whole state, though. But in general, you don't need a second language, and if you do need a second language, it's usually Spanish. In my case, I love language and I love learning about it and I love words. So creating these languages for the series was a lot of fun. Where I failed, if you will, is that my grammar, the grammar of my invented languages is very close to English because I wasn't really familiar with anything other than that. So that's one thing I would change if I were doing that now. But I love learning where words come from. You know, it's a great joy to me. And some of my names also are word plays, like Eragon himself is dragon with the first letter changed from D to E, and in English that also means an era gone by, an Eragon, which I like. Saphira is a play on sapphire. There are lots of things like that in the books, and then the rest of the names come from either historical sources or invented according to my languages. So the main language, the ancient language, I based partly on Old Norse, which is why when I come here to Germany, I recognize a lot of words. Okay. And it gave it a nice sound and feel. So there's a blessing that Eragon receives in Eldest from the elves. And I can recite it for you, but I have to apologize because I have a horrible Elvish accent. And it's not because I'm not an elf. It's because in the ancient language, you were supposed to roll your R's on the tip of your tongue the way you would in Spanish or Italian. And I can't do that. In fact, the only way I can roll my R's is by wiggling my uvula. That's the little thing in the back of your throat. So, so here's the blessing, and this will give you a bit of a sound of the language. Atresterni onovelduin, arhaner lifa uninjarta onna, undu everinia onovarda. Right. So, definitely not English. No. And then the other big language I invented for the series is the Dwarf Language, and that's my favorite because I invented it from scratch, and it's a just meaty language that you can sink your teeth into. Let's see, there's a chunk of Dwarvish I do in my presentations, and it's from Eldest again, and it's this very angry dwarf who's complaining about Eragon and Saphira being in the mountains with the dwarves. And here's the thing, is unlike the ancient language, I have an excellent Dwarvish accent, and that's because in Dwarvish you are supposed to roll your R's by wiggling your uvula. Okay, so let me see if I can remember this. Forn Rathkarach, Forn Jürgen Carmuter, Noseta Goroth Bastarnog, Dur Incesti Rakkithen, Yak Iswareth Ash Barzuligor, Dur Durgrimst Ash Schwelden Rock Anuin, Bog Tor Rak Jürgenfran. Awesome. As you can imagine, the dwarves are usually rather hoarse, and no one much likes listening to their love poems. So except other dwarves.
Another question to your favorite book you've written is a bit like the question for your favorite child.
But I have an answer.
Okay.
If we go by chronology, it would be Eragon, because Eragon is the first book I ever wrote. If we go by weight, it would be Inheritance, because that book's large enough to kill a small mammal. If we go by quality, it's none of them. It's the science fiction book. And the answer will always be the best book is the book I'm working on now. That may or may not be true, but I like to think that I'm improving as an artist, so yeah.
It's a bit hard for us in Germany to see your improvement because it's
translated.
Yes.
But, well, read it in English.
Okay. I think our publisher doesn't want to hear it. Well, of course.
Read it in German and English. That's what you do.
Good idea, of course.
Yeah.
Just another question. You are not only interested in writing books and drawing. Do you also like reading books? also at the moment, or because in Germany many authors do not have the time to still read?
That is a problem. One of the few advantages of going on book tour from a creative sense is that plane flights are a great opportunity to read. I just read, I'd have to look up the name, but I just read a book by Lawrence Krauss about why is there something instead of nothing. I think it's called A Universe from Nothing. I just read a book called What the F, which is a history of profanity and swearing in the English language. A superb book. I just read The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, which is a science fiction novel. And I feel like I'm forgetting one or two others. I read a lot when I'm traveling. I'm currently reading The Tiger's Daughter, which is a fantasy novel by Kay Arsenal. I can't say her name properly, so I'm not going to try. But and I have The Priory of the Orange Tree waiting for me at home, which is this, has a gorgeous cover. And
but it's so thick.
It's the same word count as my sci-fi novel. I asked her on Twitter. So that's the size of my sci-fi novel.
But I actually want to read this book because the size is so enormous, and I'm standing in front of the bookshelf and I'm like, first it's about dragons.
Yes,
There are dragons in it, and I haven't read a good dragon story for a very long time.
That's right.
Well, but my new book doesn't count?
But I'm reading, I have read it on the train to Leipzig. So
okay.
So it counts.
Now it counts.
Well, when I tweeted a picture of The Priory of the Orange Tree, it was so sweet because the author, Samantha Shannon, I think?
Yeah, Samantha Shannon.
She tweeted back and she said, "Oh my God," she said, "The Father of Dragons has my book." And I was like, "Oh."
He has risen.
So I'm looking forward to meet Khaleesi, Mother of Dragons.
I've not read Game of Thrones, actually.
Okay.
But you're watching the series?
No.
No.
No,
Okay.
I watched part of the first season.
Okay.
Okay, only parts. No problem. Do you have any last words to your readers in Germany, for example?
Well, I would just, a big thank you to all of you who have read the series and supported it over the years. None of this would be possible without your ongoing enthusiasm. I hope that you enjoyed the new book, The Fork, the Witch, and the Worm. It was an enormous fun for me to actually write the book. It was both nostalgic and exciting, and a bit like returning home after a long journey. So again, I want to thank you for that. I hope you enjoy my future books as much or even more. And as Eragon himself would say, Sioner Sverdar Sitya Havas. May your swords stay sharp.
Great. Thanks a lot.
My pleasure. Thank you.